You wrote I think it was an article about Africans who were involved in the slave trade.
Oh, people went crazy.
And you were widely lamented for that.
Yeah, I was trashed.
How does it feel?
But it's true.
How does it feel when you dedicate your life and obviously you have a passion for African American history?
Oh, yeah.
And African. How does it feel at that point to be called an Uncle Tom or a sellout when you're not?
You know, when I did my first series on Africa, and I have a new series that'll be out in February on Africa, I talk about the African role in the slave trade. But this is like saying that your tie is crimson. Every scholar knows this. 90%, no one disputes this figure, of all the slaves shipped across the ocean were captured by Africans, sold along the coast to white people called factors, and then shipped.
Right.
It was a business. And there were Africans who grew rich, and they were African elites, merchants, who grew rich on the slave trade. But no scholar doubted that. But when I revealed that in 1998, people, they said, how could you do that? You've revealed, no one said that I was wrong. They said, you told our deep, dirty secret.
What I'm getting at is this cultural resistance. Maybe it's from years of experiencing pain from racism.
Right. But I'm not running for mayor. I'm a professor at Harvard.
But you alluded to it earlier where you talked about the things that African Americans can do. Even if nothing else changes in the majority culture, what can African Americans do to empower themselves?
We all don't have a good image, and the image is like black. We've never thought together. You know, in Africa, a man can do what he want to do because he know who he is. But over here, you don't know. So first, we got to get an image, an identity.
When you have that discussion, it's often a very, very uncomfortable discussion.
It is.
And Bill Cosby had a lot of pushback.
Right.
Even Barack Obama, when he talked about fatherlessness.
Right.
It's looked at as respectability politics.
Right.
How do you get past that? Because the conversation needs to be had, right?
My father worked 2 jobs for 37 years. I don't have any tolerance for anybody who won't work if they can work, right? I don't think there's any excuse for not doing your homework. I don't think there's any excuse for not learning your ABCs and learning to speak standard English and learning your multiplication tables. As corny as that sounds, those values are the hallmark of African American culture. And they have been our value. Yes. Anyone who says not, they are the people betraying the traditional values of the culture. Somehow, you see what you're suggesting, somehow things got turned on their head. The people who are not calling for individual responsibility, who are not saying you must show up, you got to suck it up, man, you got to go to school, you got to learn, you have to defer gratification. They are the people who are out of sync with the black tradition. Yeah, I wouldn't call them sellouts, but I would say they have failed to understand our traditional values. That doesn't make you, I'm a Democrat, as Democrat as you could get, but I know I spend every day studying the people and the tradition that I love. I know what's black about Black America, and those values are as traditionally black as any values that you can get. But somehow it got perverted and people go, well, they're white values. What kind of ridiculous, if anybody had said anything like that when your father and I were growing up in the 50s, they smacked you upside your head.
Of course, Dr. Roland Fryer at Harvard
was a good friend of mine.
Did the study Acting White, which showed that that was a phenomenon.
Listen, and when there was
a social penalty for getting A's among some kids in our culture.
Long before I read Roland's fabulous study, I read a piece in the Washington Post. And it said, inner-city black kids have been surveyed, list things white, speaking standard English, getting straight A's, and visiting the Smithsonian. What? If I had said anything like, I wouldn't even have thought anything like that. But if you had said that, people would have sat you down and said, boy, you're going to go to hell. Because you have lost traditional black values. The reason that I teach the lecture course that I teach is to show that there's always been diversity of ideology in the black community. Why? Because I went to Yale between 69 and 73. I went to Yale with Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman from Houston, one of my best friends. Kurt Schmoke, one of the reasons, Kurt Schmoke, first black mayor of Baltimore. One of the reasons I went to Cambridge was Kurt Schmoke got a Rhodes Scholarship, went to Oxford, and I said, I want one of those too. But also, you know who else was there? Little nerdy guy, didn't know him. I only realized later that we were there. We must have been at some black party together or when they had Soul Food Weekend. Dr. Ben Carson was in my class too, and his wife Candy. I mean, we've all known each other. But we would have bullies on campus We had the Black Panthers. We went on strike for Bobby Seale's right to get a fair trial. I was the secretary of the Black Student Association.
Okay.
We had Black Panthers trying to tell us how to be black. We had the Nation of Islam, the guys with the white shirt and the bow tie. They were trying to tell us how to be black. Then we had the cultural nationalists from Amiri Baraka and Maulana Karenga. They were telling us how to be black, and their definition of blackness was all different. So I called it running the gauntlet of blackness. So you didn't even know which way was black. Was your afro supposed to be 2 feet out or 1 foot out? You know, we're supposed to have dashikis made from Nigeria or from Uganda. Did you learn Yoruba? Did you learn Swahili? So I said, if I'm ever in a position of authority and can do something about it, I'm going to teach young black kids and white kids, because we have big, large lecture classes, which of course are multiracial at a place like Harvard. And I'm going to say there never was one way to be black. There are 42 million African Americans, which means there are 42 million ways to be black.
Right.
But
okay.
And I wish everybody who could have voted would have voted for Hillary Clinton by choice, but I'm not going to demonize the people who voted for Donald Trump. That's their right to do that.
And I think what you're getting at is this widespread beyond the African American community oversimplification of race. I mean, you've spent a lot of your career challenging this and explaining to people what race really means in the context of genealogy. You're 50% white.
European.
African Americanhood is a political identity.
That's true, a social construct.
Right.
Yeah, it's
complicated.
It's complicated. It's more complicated than we think. But traditionally in America, the white working class has been baited in such a way to identify economically with people with whom they have nothing in common, wealthier white people, instead of just looking across the tracks, across the river, you know, down the road and seeing their black working class counterpart. That is the union that should have been affected so often in the history of America.
And that goes back to Jamestown between the indentured servants and the slaves.
Yes, right. And think about this. Slavery itself was race and class fused. A slave is a living economic commodity. A slave in America was a black person who was not a human being. It was a black person who was a commodity like the pigs and the horses and the chickens on a census record. So slavery was race and class fused. In other words, race and class has always been fused in the United States. And Martin Luther King realized this after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in '64 and the Voting Rights Act in '65. He began to move toward an economic analysis.
And that's when he was assassinated.
And that's when he was assassinated. And I heard Calvin Butts on a stage in New York say, you go up against the empire, that's when you get crushed. And this was a month ago. And he was talking about people who, in part, who move against the system with an economic analysis, because that's where the rubber hits the road. It's not, race is not the most important thing that divides us. It is class. It is always about the money. The history of the West is about the money. I tell my students, the floorboard of Western culture has a river running under it. If you lift up those floorboards, you know what you see? There's a stream called anti-Semitism. What's that about? Religion?
Class.
Class. Justified in the name of religion. Look down there, anti-black racism. Is that about race? No, it's about class. Justified in the name of racial difference.